I'm going to talk you through a Part B answer from the Eduqas A Level Christianity, and this is from the birth narrative section, so theme 1A. And as always, before I start talking you through my answer, I'm going to give a few disclaimers. So first of all, I sit and I type these up in 30 minutes with no notes, textbook or Bible, and so they are not perfect. There could have been, more convincing evidence chosen. Some things may have been phrased a little bit better. However, I wanted to recreate that exam experience because you don't have time to edit and polish your essays in the exam. However, I have sat and typed these in 30 minutes, and you type faster than you write. From what I've looked up online, you can aim to write about 20 to 30 words a minute, which means that you can expect to produce between 600 and 900 words in 30 minutes writing. I mean, that's quite a big margin of error, but that doesn't allow for any planning time. This essay is, when I word counted it, 900 words, and so it is on the long side by about 150 to 200 words. However, I want these to be useful to all students and that everybody gets a little nugget that they can take away to improve their work, whether that is a student on the CD borderline or a student trying to make that final step up to the A star. And so them being a little bit long means that there's more chance that everybody's going to get something of benefit. But please don't beat yourself up if you can't write this much in 30 minutes. I couldn't, not writing by hand. Also, because I know some people are looking for subject knowledge, but other people have got really solid subject knowledge and they're looking at how to put an essay together or what the examiner is looking for. As I go through, I'm going to make an effort to highlight these key skills that the examiner is looking for. And so that's language, both key terms, but also an impressive academic tone. That does not mean overly flowery, confusing language. Secondly, evident sources of wisdom, and because this is a Christianity exam, that's often from the Bible. Thirdly, some kind of analysis and evaluation, so that is you stepping into your essay and giving your view on whether the evidence that's presented is convincing. What are the implications of certain views? You need scholars and schools of thought, and you also need to be linking back to the question. Quite rightly, Eduqas are a little bit obsessed with this, and they like to see words from the statement in your paragraphs because that shows you're answering the question. I also need to say I'm filming these at home and I have a toddler who has just walked into the room, and so if you hear strange noises in the background, that's him. I have to limit these videos to 15 minutes, and so I'm not going to be able to highlight everything in every single paragraph. If you're a Lytchett student, you've got a printed copy of this, and so you might want to go through with some highlighters and do that highlighting. I'm just going to point out before we start who the scholars are. So we have got Raymond Brown, who I would say is the main scholar, and I would say he's the main scholar for birth narratives. It's written an absolutely massive book that's very, very well respected. I find it a little odd that he's not on the specification or even in the textbook for this course. Secondly, I'm going to refer to Dawes, and I will link in the box below. We've also tweeted a really, really well written article that's a respectful challenge to Brown. I've linked that on our Twitter feed as well. That's very relevant to this essay. We've also used N.T. Wright, who is a very, very important scholar for theme 1. We've linked Bultmann, who is the other main scholar for theme 1, and also Strauss, who again is not on the spec, but he's an interesting person to use in this essay because he stated that Jesus was a bit of a failure, really, and the gospel writers, the evangelists, created these wonderful stories to make him look better than he was, but there's no historical credibility, and so that's the link with this essay. So we suggest at Lytchett, and we've stolen this from Charlotte Vardy, that in a part B you start with a thesis statement. And the purpose of a thesis statement is multiple. First, it's your response to the statement, and so it means that you're answering the question. And we suggest that you return to your thesis statement in all of your evaluation, and all your evaluation should really be in line with your thesis statement. So if in your thesis statement you say that the birth narratives have no credibility, and then you keep evaluating saying they have loads of credibility, that doesn't make sense. And so the thesis statement helps you answer the question. It also gives you a point of view to keep returning to, and to return to finally in your conclusion. Finally, and I will demonstrate this with some highlighting in a moment, your thesis statement should contain the words that are in the question to show that you're answering the question. And so the thesis statement kind of sets you on the right track. And if you echo your thesis statement in your conclusion, you start and end your essay in a manner that's very focused on the question, which makes it more likely you're going to get into band 4 or above. So this statement, the original question statement, is the birth narratives lack credibility. Okay, and you will see I use the word credibility there, and there, and there. Birth narratives is there, credibility is there, and I think it's one more time as well. Okay, and the thesis statement, the view that I am taking, is that the birth stories have some historical credibility because they match with historical documents of the time. Even when the actual event isn't referred to, it fits in with what other historians tell us about the period or the people involved. But much, much more important is this idea of theological credibility. And that's an idea that comes from Raymond Brown. And I'm going to say the stories have a lot of theological credibility and some historical credibility. I'm showing the examiner that I have really looked at this statement because it doesn't say which kind of credibility. Okay. Also, right from the outset, I'm using technical language or language of an academic tone, so theological credibility, evangelists rather than authors, birth narratives rather than birth stories. So now we're going to go to paragraph 1. And so I'm in some ways echoing my thesis statement because I'm going to say that there are issues with the historical credibility. But then I'm going to introduce Brown, who's going to counter the strength of feeling about those historical inaccuracies and say they don't matter as much as the theological credibility. And so I'm taking a structure where I present a view that in some way disagrees with my thesis statement, but then I counter it with someone who agrees with my thesis statement. That's quite a good structure to use. So, as I said, there are, as you know, differences between the birth stories, whether it is the people that visit the baby Jesus, I never know whether it's Magi or Magi, the wise men, let's play it safe, or the shepherds. And then as well, the whole flight to Egypt, which of course is only in Matthew's Gospel. And then I step in and kind of doing my analysis and evaluation. And I say, you know, this criticism is quite wounding when it comes to historical credibility, because would a mother who had just given birth, flee to a country on the back of a donkey and then not tell somebody about it when she's recounting the story of her child's birth. As a woman who's had 2 children, if I'd have had to flee the, maternity ward on a donkey and go to another country, you can guarantee I would tell people. And of course, Luke is supposed to be told from the point of view of Mary. And so it seems odd that that detail is not in there. So I'm quite heavily criticising the historical credibility. Now I'm going to introduce Brown, who of course is in line with my thesis statement. And he's going to say, and look at the use of key terms, that the evangelists have made editing decisions or redactions that reflect their Sitzim Leben. And what we actually have are not historical documents or documents that are primarily concerned with history. We've got theological documents, and so that's the credibility that matters. So Matthew includes the flight to Egypt because it matches his theological point that Jesus is the new Moses. He is the Messiah. Nice key term there. Okay, whereas Luke doesn't include that detail because it does not fit in with his theological portrait. That's a lovely phrase that I've taken from Brown. And he says the theological portrait that Luke is painting is that Jesus is, and we've got some sources of wisdom here, a light for the Gentiles. Okay, he is a saviour for the poor and the oppressed, which is why we have shepherds visiting him rather than the more prestigious wise men. And then we've got a quote here from Brown, which you probably won't remember, but the sentiments are easy to remember, that the birth stories are not an embarrassment because of all the historical inaccuracies, but actually they're a masterpiece in theological writing. And so then I've returned to my thesis statement by stressing that even though there may be issues with some of the history, the theological credibility is intact. Then I'm introducing my next scholar, which is Dawes, who's going to take on Brown. And so because Dawes is criticising my thesis statement, I've got him first, and then I'm going to counter him. And so Dawes says you can't just say all that matters is theology and don't worry about history. Firstly, look at what Luke writes. He interviews eyewitnesses and tells us about it. He has historical characters, and so history matters to Luke. Even to Matthew, who's the more arguably theological gospel, or the gospel more concerned with fulfilling prophecies, the history still matters, because it matters to Matthew that Jesus fulfills the prophecies of Jeremiah and Hosea, for example, in the flight to Egypt and the massacre of the infants. And so if Jesus doesn't fulfill those prophecies, he can't be the Messiah. He has to actually do those things in history. And then I'm building my evidence, and I'm going to say that when you look at the birth story of Matthew and Luke, they are not fanciful events. Although they might not be events recorded in the history books, they're in line with what we know of the characters. So it is perfectly plausible that Herod would have massacred the infants because he killed members of his own family. He was a cruel, mad man. This is my analysis and evaluation, I say that is a convincing argument because it is. I then further back that up by referring to N.T. Wright, who says that the whole point of Jesus is the incarnation. He is God in history, and so you can't just say that history doesn't matter. So now I've got to counter that. And so I'm going to go to Bultmann, and he's going to say, but if you make too much focus on the history, you're alienating your modern reader, because these stories are packed with mythical events. Myth would count as a key term, such as angels and the virgin birth. And so there has to be more focus on the theology so we can accept these stories. And there I have linked back to the thesis statement and the original question when I say if we want to make the birth stories relevant, we have to focus on theological credibility and not just historical credibility, which is what my thesis statement says. And so then I've got my conclusion. And again, look at my conclusion. Just like my thesis statement, the words historical credibility or credibility appear over and over again, along with birth narratives. And I'm concluding by saying there is some historical credibility, but theology matters more.